Hi guys, my name's Adam and welcome to my new video. This one is gonna be a little different from my previous videos. As I was making the last one about the iPad, I realized how much this product has changed over the years. And now when the new 2020 iPad Pro was announced, I heard some people saying that they're not gonna upgrade because there's almost no new features or improvements. So I think it's a great opportunity to look back at the whole history of Apple's iPad and see how much it has evolved since the original one was introduced. So let's take a road down the memory lane with me. Here we go. The first iPad was introduced in January 2010 and was released in April that year. It quickly became the fastest selling consumer product ever released. It was a revolutionary tablet and was made from glass on the front and aluminum on the back. At its time, iPad was praised for being thin and light, but from today's point of view, it's actually quite thick and heavy, at least compared to the newer models. iPad featured a 9.7-inch screen with multi-touch technology, which Apple first introduced with the iPhone 3 years before that. The first iPad came with a single-core A4 CPU, the same as the iPhone 4, and 256 megabytes of RAM. Interestingly, the first iPad did not feature any camera at all, not on the back and not on the front, so you could not make a video call with the iPad. This iPad originally shipped with iPadOS 3.2, yes you heard right, iPadOS, and later you could upgrade it up to iOS 5.1.1, which is the latest version this device can run. It was discontinued in March 2011. The successor to the original iPad was released almost exactly 1 year after the first one. It featured a major redesign as it was 33% thinner than the original iPad, and it was lighter as well. It had the same 9.7-inch screen with the exact same resolution, so not a Retina screen just yet. It finally came with a camera, not one but two cameras, one on the front and one on the back. The quality of these cameras was nothing special, but it was good enough to make FaceTime calls for sure. iPad 2 was also much faster than the original. It was powered by the dual-core A5 CPU and 512 megabytes of RAM, and Apple declared the same 10-hour battery life. iPad 2 came in two colors, black and white, and unlike the first iPad, it was actually supported by Apple for an incredible 5 years. It originally shipped with the iOS 4.3 and could be upgraded up to iOS 9.3.6. iPad 2 was discontinued in March 2014. With the third generation of its tablet, Apple really messed up the naming scheme. The third generation was officially marketed by Apple as the new iPad, but almost everyone called it the iPad 3 or iPad third generation. It was released in March 2012. The design of the device stayed the same as the iPad 2, but Apple finally added the Retina screen, which was the main selling point of this device. It also featured improved 5-megapixel rear camera with the ability to shoot 1080p video. The new iPad was powered by the improved dual-core A5X CPU with massively improved quad-core graphics and 1GB of RAM for the first time in the iPad. It originally shipped with iOS 5.1 and you could upgrade it up to iOS 9.3.5. The new iPad was on sale only for 221 days as it was discontinued in October 2012. The naming of the fourth generation iPad was even weirder because it was marketed as iPad with Retina display, even though the previous generation also featured the Retina screen. Fourth generation was introduced in October 2012 and it came with just a few improvements over the third generation. Mainly, it got rid of the old 30-pin charging connector and introduced the Lightning port to the iPad for the very first time. Design and camera-wise, it was the same as the third generation, but performance was greatly improved as it featured dual-core A6X CPU with quad-core graphics and 1GB of RAM. Also, the new 128GB storage option was introduced with this model. Fourth generation iPad originally shipped with iOS 6 and could be upgraded up to iOS 10.3.3. It was discontinued after 2 years in October 2014. In October 2012, Apple also introduced a new iPad form factor and it was the first generation iPad mini. As the name suggests, this was basically a small version of the iPad as it features 7.9-inch display. The screen resolution was quite low at 1024 by 768, which was definitely no Retina panel. Design was a little bit tweaked as the size of the bezels around the screen was reduced. It features the same 5-megapixel iSight camera as the standard size iPads and 1.2-megapixel FaceTime HD camera. The iPad mini was powered by a dual-core A5 CPU and 512 MB of RAM, so it was basically the iPad 2 in a different size. The mini came with a 16, 32 and 64 GB of storage, and it originally shipped with iOS 6, and you could upgrade it up to iOS 9.3.5. The iPad mini was discontinued in June 2015. In October 2013, Apple switched up their iPad naming scheme once again as they introduced the first iPad Air. At a first sight, the Air looked much different than the 4th generation iPad, as it featured a similar design to the iPad mini, only with a bigger 9.7-inch screen. Air was 20% thinner and 28% lighter than the 4th generation. Of course, it featured the Retina screen and dual cameras as the previous generation. iPad Air was powered by a dual-core A7 CPU, which was 64-bit for the first time in the iPad. It also featured 1GB of RAM. iPad Air was sold in two colors, space gray and silver, and in 16, 32, 64 and 128GB storage options. The Air originally shipped with iOS 7, and it could be upgraded up to iOS 12.4.5. It was discontinued in March 2016. With the iPad Air, Apple also introduced the new iPad mini 2. This one finally featured high-resolution Retina display. Otherwise, the design stayed the same as the first iPad mini. The Mini 2 was basically just a smaller iPad Air, as it featured the same hardware specifications: 64-bit A7 CPU, 1GB of RAM, and the same set of cameras. It also came in 16, 32, 64, and 128GB storage options. It originally shipped with iOS 7, and it could be upgraded up to iOS 12.4.5. The iPad mini 2 was on sale for almost 4 years and was discontinued in March 2017. In October 2014, Apple introduced the successor to the iPad Air, and that was the iPad Air 2. This one came with a bunch of new features and improvements. Apple managed to reduce its size, so the Air 2 was only 6.1mm thick, and it was also lighter than the first Air at only 444 grams. iPad Air 2 brought a new laminated screen technology, Touch ID fingerprint scanner integrated to the home button, and a new set of cameras with the improved 8-megapixel rear camera. Second generation Air also featured a massive performance improvements, as it was powered by a triple-core A8X CPU and 2GB of RAM. iPad Air 2 originally shipped with iOS 8.1, and surprisingly it's still supported today, so you can update it to the latest iPadOS 13.4. Air 2 was discontinued in March 2017. Alongside the iPad Air 2, Apple also announced the iPad mini 3, but this one didn't include almost any improvements over the mini 2. Only difference was the addition of Touch ID fingerprint scanner and the new gold color option. Everything else, including the CPU and 1GB of RAM, stayed the same. iPad mini 3 originally shipped with iOS 8.1 and could be upgraded up to iOS 12.4.5. It was discontinued in September 2015. In September 2015, Apple announced 4th generation of iPad mini. The iPad mini 4 featured the same design as every other iPad mini, but Apple still managed to make a few changes to this one. It featured a better camera with 8-megapixel rear sensor and the same 1.2-megapixel front sensor. Hardware of the iPad mini 4 was also significantly improved, as it was powered by a dual-core 1.5 GHz A8 CPU and 2 GB of RAM. iPad mini 4 originally came with iOS 9, and it can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4. In September 2015, Apple introduced the first iPad Pro. It had a similar design as the Air 2, but it came with a massive 12.9-inch screen. The Pro was meant to shift the focus of the iPad from the media consumption to more creative and productivity work. With the introduction of this tablet, Apple also introduced two new accessories, Smart Keyboard and Apple Pencil, which were supposed to help make using the iPad be more productive. iPad Pro was also the most powerful iPad to date, as it was powered by a 64-bit 2.2 GHz dual-core A9X CPU and a massive 4 GB of RAM. The iPad Pro also used new 4-speaker system for better sound quality. It came in 32, 128 and 256 GB storage option, and it originally shipped with iOS 9.1, but it can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4. iPad Pro was discontinued in June 2017. In March 2016, Apple announced a smaller version of the iPad Pro. It came with a few drawbacks compared to the bigger Pro, but also with a few improvements as well. It featured the same design as the iPad Air 2 with the 9.7-inch screen, but this LCD panel supported the new True Tone technology, which helped with adjusting white balance. It has the same set of cameras as the bigger Pro, with the rear 12-megapixel sensor and front-facing 5-megapixel camera. Of course, you can use the Apple Pencil and Smart Keyboard with this iPad Pro. But hardware was a little different compared to the bigger Pro. It featured the same A9X CPU, but only 2 GB of RAM instead of 4 GB in the bigger one. It came in same storage variants and space gray, silver, gold and rose gold colors. 9.7-inch iPad Pro originally shipped with iOS 9.3, but it can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4. It was discontinued in June 2017. In March 2017, Apple announced the new 9.7-inch iPad, which was aimed as a lower-end model. It featured the exact same design as the first iPad Air, with 9.7-inch non-laminated display. But unlike the first Air, this one featured the Touch ID fingerprint scanner. 9.7-inch iPad was powered by 1.8 GHz dual-core A9 CPU and 2 GB of RAM. It came in gold, silver and space gray, and 32 and 128 GB storage options. It originally shipped with iOS 10.3, but it can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4. 9.7-inch iPad was discontinued in March 2018. In June 2017, Apple introduced the new iPad Pros. First one was the model with 10.5-inch screen. The design was very similar to the first iPad Pro, but the bezels around the screen were a little bit smaller. 10.5-inch LCD display also featured a new ProMotion technology, which brought 120Hz refresh rate to the iPad screen. Hardware was also improved, as it now featured a 6-core 2.3 GHz A10X Fusion chip and 4 GB of RAM. Of course, it supported the Smart Keyboard as well as the Apple Pencil. It came in silver, space gray, gold and rose gold. It originally shipped with iOS 10.3.2, but it can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4. 10.5-inch iPad Pro was discontinued in March 2018. And alongside this model, Apple also introduced the 12.9-inch version, which was design-wise the same as the first iPad Pro, but inside it had the same specifications as the 10.5-inch. In March 2018, Apple introduced the successor to the basic 2017's 9.7-inch iPad, which was marketed as an educational device. The design stayed the same, but Apple added a support for the first-generation Apple Pencil. It also featured 8-megapixel rear camera and 1.2-megapixel front-facing camera. 6th generation 9.7-inch was powered by a quad-core A10 Fusion chip and 2 GB of RAM. It came in 32 and 128 GB storage option, and it originally shipped with iOS 11.4, but it can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4. This model was discontinued in September 2019. In the October 2018, Apple introduced the new generation of iPad Pros. They came in an 11-inch and 12.9-inch and brought a massive amount of changes to the iPad. They introduced the new all-screen design and removed the home button for the very first time on the iPad. Face ID scanner became the main form of authentication on these iPads. Apple also added new set of cameras with the rear 12-megapixel sensor and the front 7-megapixel camera. 2018 iPad Pros were powered by the 8-core A12X Bionic chip and 4GB of RAM. It came in 64, 256, 512 and 1TB storage option, which was the only version which got 6GB of RAM. These models were also the first iPad to equip the USB-C connector instead of the Lightning port. Apple also introduced the second generation of the Apple Pencil alongside this model, and this pencil only works with these iPad Pro models. 2018 iPad Pros originally shipped with iOS 12.1, and they can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4. They were discontinued in March 2020. In March 2019, Apple announced the third generation of iPad Air, but they just called it the iPad Air. It was aimed to the middle range of the iPads. This iPad Air's design is identical to the 10.5-inch iPad Pro, but there are a few differences. iPad Air has only 8-megapixel camera with no flash and only 2 speakers instead of 4 on the iPad Pro. The Air also didn't feature the ProMotion display technology, but it does feature support for the first generation Apple Pencil as well as the Smart Keyboard. Third generation iPad Air is powered by a 6-core A12 CPU and 3GB of RAM. It originally shipped with iOS 12.2, but can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4. It is still being sold new by Apple. In March 2019, alongside the iPad Air, Apple also announced the iPad mini 5th generation, which they just called the iPad mini. The design of this one is the same as the design of every other iPad mini in the past, but inside Apple changed a lot. This new iPad mini featured 6-core Apple A12 CPU and 3GB of RAM, the same as the new iPad Air. They also added a support for the first generation Apple Pencil. The 5th generation mini has 64 and 256GB storage options and silver, gold and space gray color variants. It originally shipped with iOS 12.2, but it can be upgraded to the latest iPadOS 13.4, and it is still being sold new by Apple. In September 2019, Apple announced the successor to the low-end iPad, and they just called it the iPad. It features a bigger display than its predecessor at 10.2-inch instead of 9.7-inch, but the size is almost similar as Apple has shrunken the bezels around the screen. It also supports the first generation Apple Pencil, but other specs are quite similar to the 2018 iPad. It is powered by the same A10 Fusion CPU, but it now has 3GB of RAM instead of just 2 in the previous model. It comes in 32 and 128GB storage options and silver, gold and space gray color variants. It was originally shipped with iPadOS 13, and you can upgrade it to the latest iPadOS 13.4. This model is still being sold new by Apple. In March 2020, Apple announced the new iPad Pros. These are just incremental upgrades of the 2018 Pros. They come in the same 11-inch and 12.9-inch versions, and the design is mostly the same as the 2018 ones. The only difference is the camera, as the 2020 models now feature the dual camera setup, which is 95% similar to the iPhone 11 cameras. The only difference seems to be the ultra-wide sensor, which is 10 megapixel on the iPad Pro 2020 instead of 12 megapixel on the iPhone 11. But iPad Pro 2020 features the new LiDAR sensor, which is used to determine distance by measuring how long it takes light to reach an object and reflect back, which helps a lot in the AR content. The screen appears to stay the same as the 2018 models. 2020 iPad Pros are powered by A12Z CPU and 6GB of RAM, and are sold in 128, 256, 512 and 1TB storage options. It is being shipped with iPadOS 13.4. So that's it guys, that's the whole history of the Apple iPad. It has come a long way in the past decade, and I'm glad I did this video to remind myself of the evolution of this product. What do you think about the iPad? Do you own one? Let me know in the comment section. Also give me a thumbs up if you like this video, and consider subscribing for more content like this, it helps me a lot. I have many more videos prepared for you guys in the near future, so stay tuned for that. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and see you in the next video. Bye!